I hear we're going to the range today. Yes, I'm shooting the 3rd class. That doesn't surprise me. Well, what class are you shooting today then? 2nd class. Well, who's shooting the 1st class? No. Who's in the 2nd class with me? Who? Yes. No. Who's shooting the 1st class? I told you. Who's shooting the 2nd class? Well, apart from you, I don't know. But I was asking about the 1st. What is shooting the 1st class? Well, I don't know. That's why I'm asking. Okay, Lou. Lou?
By 1879, musketry training had attained a certain degree of maturity. The Army had been completely rifle-armed since the late 1850s, and the intervening 20 years had seen the passing of the muzzle-loading era and the advent of the breech-loader. The Martini-Henry was a powerful weapon and had, for its era, a formidable foundation in its simplicity of use, rate of fire, range, and stopping power. In order to harness these attributes, a significant amount of training was required. This culminated in the annual qualification. 90 rounds were allotted, and these were expended in a combination of individual fire, volley fire, independent fire, and live fire skirmishing practices. The comprehensiveness of this training reflects the professionalism of those who practiced it, and the resultant effectiveness of musketry delivered with the Martini-Henry over countless battlefields. In this video, we'll examine the annual range work of 1879. For that, I'll be shooting my Mark I Martini-Henry, that viewers of the channel will be most familiar with. Stand by. Stone Forest Ranges circa 1879, coming up.
The Martini-Henry is perhaps the most well-known rifle of Empire. It served in frontline service from the early to mid-1870s through to the early 1890s, and for some time after in second-line duties. During that time, musketry practices evolved quite considerably in some ways, while remaining quite pedestrian in others. Throughout the era, the skills taught and practiced on the range generally reflected the intended use of the rifle on the battlefield, and this must be understood when examining these programs. When we look at various actions fought during the 1870s and the 1880s, we can see that generally musketry training did indeed prepare the Army for the kinds of action it would face. There of course were exceptions, but generally these can be related to greater tactical decisions and resultant situations rather than strictly due to musketry specifically. As discussed in previous videos, there was considerable attention paid to preliminary training. Call it musketry theory. Training in care and cleaning, holding, aiming, and firing was augmented, especially later in the era, by the use of sub-caliber ammunition fired from an adapter known as the Morris tube. All of this prepared the recruit and refreshed the trained man for work on the range with full-bore ammunition. Range work throughout the era was divided into generally two distinct parts: individual practices and collective practices. By the 1880s, these were augmented by a number of field firing practices, which could be shot either individually or collectively, depending on the scope and purpose thereof. Later in the era, these two classifications were somewhat blurred, but more on that later. The British Army went through a change in the 1870s and on into the 1880s, as tactical lessons were learnt from experience and absorbed through the experiences of other armies as they fought elsewhere. The Franco-Prussian War providing a particularly important and valuable example. There were no less than 4 regulations published between 1874 and 1887. Each made incremental changes to the body of range work. Upon examination, one can trace the evolution from perhaps the simpler and more straightforward practices as were used in the mid-Victorian era with the P-53 and later the Snider, through to the much more complex and dynamic practices that were introduced in the 1880s to give musketry a more tactical bent, as we might say today. The musketry program adapted to this new paradigm, and the era of the Martini would see the introduction of rapid shooting, snap shooting, shooting at moving targets, as well as perhaps somewhat more dynamic practices, such as the introduction of what today would be termed a rundown, whereby the man would move in rushes, firing alternately as he made his way towards the target. All of this was brought together in larger collective field firing practices, in which live fire attacks were made over hundreds of yards to arrive on enemy positions and clear them with the bayonet. While hugely interesting when taken as a whole, we must perhaps examine each part of the musketry program of the 1870s and 80s to understand things as a whole. While collective and field firing practices gradually became more complex and meaningful, they could not be undertaken effectively without a good, solid understanding of skills in basic shooting. For that, a series of individual practices were used to allow for personal development and the recognition of individual achievement. Here, in this video, we'll examine an example of the individual practices, dating from 1879. We can see here in this table that there were 6 practices of 10 rounds each, divided into 3 classes, shot at 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, and 800 yards in prescribed positions. Firing positions of the era included the standing position, the kneeling position, and what was termed the lying position, or prone. The back position was certainly used in competitive shooting as shown here, but as it regards the individual practices of 1879, it was not authorized. Although targetry has already been covered in great detail in the introduction video to Martini musketry, perhaps a short review of the pertinent versions here. The targets were made out of 2-foot by 6-foot iron plates, bolted together as required. The third-class target, used for trained men at 200 and 300 yards, was 4 foot wide by 6 feet high and featured a 12-inch bull and 36-inch inner. The second-class target, used at 500 and 600 yards, was 6 feet by 6 feet square and featured a bull of 24 inches with an inner of 48. The first-class target, used at 7 and 800 yards, was comprised of 4 targets, placed together to render a total width of 8 feet and a height of 6. The bull was 36 inches and the inner 60. Scoring of these targets was thus: a hit on the bull was worth 4 points, a hit on the inner worth 3, and the outer, or the remainder of the target, was worth 2 points. Although for some practices during the era ricochets counted, in 1879 for the individual practices they did not, and scored 0. The standard for scoring was quite simple, though it differed from previous iterations. Previously, each class had been a gateway of sorts, requiring a certain score to progress to the next class. From 1879, this practice would be amended with the aggregate score of all 3 classes, determining the individual level of achievement. If a man was able to obtain 130 points in the 6 individual practices, he was deemed a marksman. If he was able to attain 100, a first-class shot. And all those failing to obtain 100 points were deemed to be second-class shots. There were awards and badges that accompanied these various levels of achievement. These will be covered towards the end of the video. There was a provision for the category of third-class shots, but this seems to have been primarily related to recruits coming out of the depot. If they hadn't been able to gain 70 points in individual practices, they were categorized as such and made to annually go through the entire recruit course on musketry before firing the annual course.
Now, most of the shooting, according to the manual, was to be done in what was known as drill order. For Highland units, it looked like this. Now, I don't have such a uniform. But what I am going to do is take the Glengarry, which was the undress headdress worn in drill order, and I'm going to replace the feather bonnet with it. The wear and tear put on the feather bonnet, I think, justifies the use of this simple piece of headdress. The other thing that you might notice is the fact that I'm wearing marching order for the P71 valise equipment. I felt that drill order, which simply is a belt, a bayonet, and one pouch, just doesn't do it justice, and I thought that I might explore the range work wearing the complete ensemble. The valise and the greatcoat were intended to be worn for collective practices, volley firing and independent firing in close order.
The ammunition used for the Martini was perhaps as iconic as the rifle itself, and consisted of a rolled brass foil case with a 480 grain lead tin paper patched bullet measuring .451 in diameter. This sat atop 85 grains of powder. Packaged in packets of 10 rounds, 70 would form the battle load of the soldier in the field. For range work, only the requisite number of rounds for each practice would be issued. In the case of the complete equipment, these packets were carried in the 2 pouches slung on the belt and would be emptied into the expense pouch carried on the right hip for easy access. In the case of the use of the equipment in drill order, the loose rounds would simply be carried in the single pouch on the belt. Now, quite obviously, I'm not using period ammunition for this evolution. I am, however, using a facsimile thereof that viewers of the channel will be quite familiar with. I use a slightly modified version of the service bullet, which is parallel-sided instead of being tapered like the original, as this is much easier to paper patch. This sits atop 85 grains of 2F powder in an X-Ring Services case. There's a 3-part Martini ammunition series on the channel for more information if you so desire. Typically, the method of conducting the practices would be for a group of men, generically known as a squad, of not more than 20, to form up just behind the firing point, under the direction of a supervising officer. Then, one by one, they would move 2 paces forward, adopt the appropriate fire position, make ready, and fire. With the hit signaled and their score obtained, they would then move off to the rear, awaiting their squad mates to finish the same evolution. Thus, the squad would fire one at a time till all had fired, thereafter repeating the process until each man had fired the requisite number of rounds. There was provision for the men to fire all of their rounds consecutively when using the lying position, presumably as an expedient. This was a long-standing method of conducting a range practice, and had been used all the way back in the muzzleloading era of the 1850s and 60s. Now obviously I have shot these practices by myself, and all of them have featured the requisite number of rounds fired in their entirety. Although there were historical registers contained within the manual and obtainable through the supply system to record scores, I have used this simple spreadsheet to perform this function, and will be featured regularly throughout the video. The first practice of the 3rd class was at 200 yards, standing 10 rounds at the 3rd class target. 1879 saw the return of the round bullseye to Army targetry. For the previous 15 years or so, the bull and concentric scoring rings had transitioned to rectangular versions. With considerably less area, these newly reintroduced round versions would presumably reflect the greater accuracy of the Martini over its forebears. As explored in other videos, techniques of fouling management, most prominently being that of blow tubing, was not in any way part of military musketry, as distinct from competitive musketry. There, the utmost in advantage was sought, though within certain parameters. The aforementioned blow tubing to soften fouling, micrometer-adjusted sights, and alternate positions from which to shoot figured prominently. On the military range, however, none of these were allowed or deemed practical.
That was the first practice of the 3rd class, fired at 200 yards at the 3rd class target, 10 rounds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. all in the inner, which is a good thing. Remember, 4, 3, 2, and misses are worth nothing. So with the 3 in there and the 7 in the inner, that gives a total of 33 points.
The hits were somewhat wider than I was hoping for, but 33 points was reasonable moving forward. The next practice of the third class was the 300-yard practice, kneeling 10 rounds at the third class target. I found the 300-yard practice to be somewhat similar in difficulty to the 200. What gave more difficulty in the greater range and visibly smaller target was made up for to a degree by the steadiness gained from the kneeling position. This was the only practice in which the kneeling position was prescribed. Moving forward in the practices, a choice of positions would be offered.
Right, that was the second practice of the third class. Shot at 300 yards for the kneeling position at the same third class target. Well, the group looks, all right, I suppose. I haven't done a lot of target work like this at 300 yards with the Martini, so given that, I'm okay with what I see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Only one in the black, but the rest of them are inners, so that gives a total of 31 points.
The group was quite similar to the previous one, perhaps due to the aforementioned balance in range and position. With 2 practices down, I was well on the way to a first-class shot with 64 points. The first practice of the second class was 10 rounds at a second-class target, shot at 500 yards from any military position. The 500-yard practice required a considerable relocation to ensure the correct range was attained. This meant climbing. The heat of the day and the full dress less the bonnet certainly let me know of each step on the way up. In the terminology of the era, any military position referred to any of those taught as part of the firing exercise and practiced in position drill, covered separately here on the channel, and the man had the choice of whichever he wanted. As you can see, I chose the prone or lying position for best stability. A feature of military musketry, especially relevant to the lying position, was the inability to use either the sling or any kind of rest for stability. One caveat was that while field firing, natural objects could be used for supporting the hand and rifle as the men came across them during the evolution, and any position could be used, including, as it would appear, the aforementioned back position.
Well, this is the third time I've used this firing point, and, well, apart from the hike up here, it's well worth it. You can see the target right in there. That's at 500 yards. And the view, well, viewers of the channel will have seen this before. So that was the 500-yard practice. 10 rounds at that range at the second class target. That measures 6 foot square. It's a little bit spread out, but generally I'm pretty happy with that. Get out the old pointer here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, way up there. So, I mean, it's not exactly a sniper rifle, is it? But, you know, if you measure the distance from the top to the bottom, it's about, probably just under 4 feet. And from left to right, it's certainly within the space of a man. And at 500 yards with a Martini, this would be probably the range that engagements at decisive range. That is to say that the firepower would be truly telling. So all in, with 4 hits in the bull, 1, 2, 3, 4 hits in the inner and 2 in the outer, that gives a total of 32 points.
There seemed to be a bit of a theme with the scores here, with so far them all being in the low 30s. No matter, with 3 practices yet to go, I was nearly at first class with 96 points. The second practice of the second class was 10 rounds from 600 yards at the second class target, from any military position.
The thing about Stone Forest Ranges is that it's quite a large complex, so that you never know where you're going to have the opportunity, perhaps in the middle of another project, to shoot to 600 yards. That's what I'm going to do today. There's the target. It's looking awfully small.
This practice was shot some time ago, whilst I was shooting footage for the South Africa series. And that is why we see this, costume change, as it were. What this ended up affording was insight for me, and indeed the viewer, into what drill order was like for the rest of the line infantry. The frock, the Glengarry, the waist belt with one lone pouch and bayonet that was worn by the lion's share of the British infantry, and with some minor differences, by the armies around the Empire, such as the Canadian militia. I'm going to refrain from making any more comments, for as you will hear, this day proved to feature particularly majestic acoustics.
Well, let's just say shooting in drill order is so much more comfortable than shooting in full marching order. Like with any shooting, the less encumbered you are, typically the better you shoot. Although I'm not quite sure how that's going to play out. Because here at Stone Forest Ranges, if it's not snow-capped mountain peaks, then it's mountain lakes and meadows. Honestly, it just doesn't stop around here. So, let's count them up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Well, it's quite the group. From here to there. Now, still dangerous, mind you, but boy, 600 yards. That's going to be interesting when we get out to 7 and 8, that's for sure. So, highest possible score is 40. We have minus 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that gives a score of 29 out of 40. Not my best day.
Things certainly spread out here, and for the first time, my score dipped below 30 points. That said, the total for this put me well within first-class status. It was time for the first-class practices, the first of which was 10 rounds from 700 yards at a first-class target in any military position. I was able to use the same location, albeit on a different outing, but move the firing point back from the 600-yard point that I had used earlier. It took a bit of doing to line things up through the gap in the trees, but it worked out. The position wasn't the greatest, as it inclined downhill slightly, but I made do, or at least tried to. With the somewhat exaggerated downhill slope, what became apparent in very short order was the fact that the folded blanket on my back, in place of the greatcoat, was pushing considerably against the back of my head. This, combined with the already elevated sight picture, made for some degree of difficulty. Not exactly natural alignment, as it were. Something quite unforeseen and unfortunate happened during the filming of this practice. Through a technical difficulty, the audio was nearly completely lost for the segment. I didn't know this till I returned home, and as you might understand, I was quite disappointed. It fell to the significant technical expertise of the extensive British muzzleloader sound department and the hundreds that worked there to come to my aid and make things as realistic as possible while providing for the least amount of distraction. Pew! 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 If you are perhaps wondering why there is no target analysis for the 700-yard practice, the reason for this will be forthcoming. As I ramped up to what was supposed to be the 800-yard practice, circumstances would present themselves such that the entire first class would be shot and scored together as one. This last practice proved to be the most problematic. Try as I might, I just couldn't find a position to shoot an 800-yard practice from, without incorporating significant tree felling activities. I probably spent 2 hours trying to make things work, ultimately not finding a way. While initially somewhat dejected, I was reminded of a passage in the musketry regulation that actually alluded to such a circumstance. While musketry standards around the Empire were promulgated with best practices in mind, the realities of perhaps isolated stations around the world, or even at home, sometimes manifested themselves through a lack of range facilities as required in the regulation. To this end, there was provision placed in the text for the use of shorter ranges as part of the annual qualification, and any necessary deviations from scoring that might have to occur. There was provision made for ranges as short as 300 yards, but in my case, the 700-yard limit was particularly applicable. As you can see, there was no real implication, and the 700-yard practice was simply repeated. Stand by, this is going to be the fastest martini practice you've ever seen. Whew! Well, here we are with our first class target, used at 7 and 800 yards. Now, as mentioned in the preamble, I wasn't able to secure an 800-yard firing point, much to my disappointment. Now, you might be wondering why the target is here and not in the position it was when I was shooting it. That is because of a rather, shall we say, biblical weather event that occurred just as I was moving forward to the target. So I basically cut my losses at that point and packed everything up as fast as I could and kept most of it dry. This and this. So here we are, which is in fact the next day in much better weather and set up here for presentation purposes. So let's see how I did. 1, 2, 3, 4. Would have been nicer if that number was a bit bigger. 5, 6, 7,
8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. Better just double check that.
A few moments later.
It appears as though I've completely missed the target with 4 rounds out of 20. That's no good. I couldn't tell you where they went. Shooting at 700 yards by yourself without a spotter is, well, a bit of a leap of faith, as it were. So, there it is, 16 hits out of 20 with 4 bull, 6 center, and 6 outer. And the score for that is... wait for it. 46 for the first class.
With all of the first class shot and a total of 46 points scored, I simply split the total and divided it between the 2 practices. It may have been interesting to examine each practice individually, but this was simply not feasible given the distances and the impending weather conditions experienced on the day. So, with the 6 individual practices complete, all that was left was to tally the score. All in, I scored 171 points out of a possible 240. While not stunning, it was good enough to be classed a marksman, even with the reshot 700-yard practice in lieu of the 800. As alluded to earlier in the video, the scores obtained in these practices were the basis for any awards and badges in recognition of good shooting. As of 1879, they were as follows. For the best shot within the infantry, Royal Engineers, and colonial units, a medal of silver, but earlier of bronze, and £20 sterling was awarded. This medal was only awarded from 1869 until 1883, although a similar medal was reintroduced in 1923. To the best shot within a battalion, £5 and a badge of crossed rifles surmounted with a crown on the left arm, worked in gold. To the best shot of every company, a prize of £2 10 shillings, and a badge of crossed rifles in gold. To all marksmen, with a number not greater than 10% of the given battalion, a prize of £1, and a badge of crossed rifles in worsted. For those outside of that 10%, they were allowed to wear the badge only. In addition to these individual awards, there was an honorary award bestowed upon every sergeant of the best shooting company within the battalion. This badge was worn on the right sleeve and consisted of crossed rifles and a crown in gold. Here we can see some examples of marksmanship badges being worn during the era. The colour sergeant in the middle is wearing the badge for the best shot in the battalion. Amongst these men of the 1st Battalion Seaforth Highlanders in 1882, we can see a couple that are wearing the badge of a marksman. Here we can see non-commissioned officers of the newly created Manchester Regiment, displaying their worsted marksman's badge. Although it's difficult to tell in the colorized photograph, we might take this as an example of the gold crossed rifles symbolizing best shot of a given company. It's important to take these distinctions as far as badges and awards go in the proper context of the 1879 regulation. Like musketry in general throughout the Martini era, the system of badges and awards changed incrementally throughout the era. So, with it all said and done, I felt that it would be okay to put up the crossed rifles on my doublet, having legitimately achieved the requisite score. This brings us to the end of our examination of the individual practices of 1879. Perhaps here a small bit of context, placing the skills exhibited in a real-world scenario. At the Battle of Saint Juana in 1879, the 6 companies of the 24th deployed along the rocky ridge to the north of that famous mountain. They had commanding views of the Zulu host as it descended the Inyoni escarpment and moved to attack. It would seem that the men of the 24th commenced their fire at close to the maximum range that they had trained to, 800 yards. Shown here in this diagram are the general arcs of fire of these 6 companies, stretching to that same range. As it was, within these areas, the Zulus were checked decisively, and it was only upon the outflanking of the 24th that the collapse of the position was made inevitable. The infantry of the 1870s and 80s would have to face all and sundry threats, from fast-moving masked enemy to skulking, hiding opponents, who would test the very fabric of the tactical paradigm of the age. All through the era, the Martini, in capable hands, brought a degree of firepower which, when harnessed appropriately, contributed to many victories and stove off many defeats. While the record of the infantry as a whole is not the purpose here, it is important to relate the training of the British and Empire soldiers to the experience of the battlefield. Following on in the next video in the Musketry of the Martini-Henry series, we'll begin to tackle some of the collective and field firing practices that made up the balance of the annual qualification throughout the era. I have to thank friend of the channel, Chris, who kindly sent along the wonderful muzzle protector, as seen at the beginning of this video, as well as an excellent Victorian-era belt buckle. Chances are that will feature in the next Martini video. And to my friends at the Die Hard Company for the kind provision of a couple of their photographs. For all your Snyder or Martini reloading needs, talk to Martin at X-Ring Services. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. And for more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page.